Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Mark Williamson from Action for Happiness, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to this very special webinar evening with Laurie Santos to talk about happiness lessons and what we can do to put the science of well-being into practice, not only in our own lives, but in the way that we build our societies and treat each other too. So Laurie, first of all, a very warm welcome. It's lovely to see you and have you with us this evening.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm seeing that we've already got lots and lots of participants joining us, thousands already. So as people are joining, I'll just give a very brief introduction and set the scene for this evening. We're very grateful to you sparing your precious time to be with us. I know you're incredibly busy with the huge popularity in your work. So Laurie doesn't really need any introduction to anyone who's been following the world of happiness in recent months and years. But you are, of course, a professor of psychology at Yale University, where your amazing class, Psychology and the Good Life, became, I think, the most popular in Yale's history, and has been followed up with this incredible online course, The Science of Wellbeing, which now I think you said 2.6 million people have taken. So that's absolutely brilliant. And later on, we'll share with the audience details of how you can get involved in that. In terms of this evening's event, Laurie, we wanted to go through a few things with you. First of all, a bit about your insights from the science of happiness, perhaps the ones we might expect, but also some surprising ones, and then come to the current situation we find ourselves in the world, the COVID crisis, some of the upheaval we're seeing in terms of racial equality and other issues around the world at the moment, and perhaps leaving with a more personal note of what we can all do to put this into practice in our own lives. So we'll probably spend about half an hour together in discussion, hearing from you. And then to all the audience out there, and I can see that many more people are still joining us right now, we'd love to hear your questions too. So if you're new to using Zoom webinar, people, then please do see the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. We obviously won't have time to address all of your questions, but I'd love to put some of your questions to Laurie this evening. So we'll spend about 15 minutes on that, and then to wrap up about 7:45 London time, so that's 2:45 Eastern your time, Laurie. So thank you once again for being here, and thank you to the thousands of people who've signed up for this event. I'd like to start really, if it's okay with you, just to sort of allow you to set the scene on your long-standing interest in the science of happiness and the work that you've been doing. And perhaps as part of that, you could share what's always on my mind when I hear about these things, which is what matters most, Laurie, in all your digging into this. What are some of the most important principles we should be starting with here?
Yeah, well, I get that question a lot, especially teaching, very type A Yale students. Yale students are like, I don't have time for all the peripheral stuff. Like, give me the ones that tips that matter the most for happiness. I think honestly what matters most is very individual. It kind of depends on what you're doing already. So when we go through different tips, sometimes you hear stuff and you're like, oh, I've been putting that into practice in my own life a lot. That one's not for you, but sometimes you hear different interventions and you think, oh, I'm not really focused on that one, then that one becomes the most important. But, I can just speak for me, the kinds of things that have really changed my life a lot. And, the biggest one for me, honestly, has been recognizing the importance of time and how you spend your time. There's a lot of new work coming out in positive psychology right now on the concept of time affluence, which is this subjective sense that you have a whole bunch of time, right? It's the opposite of what many of us feel on a daily basis, which is time famine, where we're like literally starving for time. And some lovely work by Ashley Willens, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, has been showing like how bad time famine really is. Like in some of her work, she shows that experiencing a lot of time famine can be as bad for your mental health as experiencing a year of unemployment. So losing your job is basically as bad as kind of feeling trapped for time. And so, there's this question about like, what can you do to feel better? And Ashley has some really wonderful tips. In fact, she has a book that's just coming out this week called Time Smart, about all these different tips for how you can protect your time. So if you want a great resource, everyone on the line should kind of check that out. But one of the insights she talks about in her book is that what's surprising is that even though we're all feeling so time famished, a lot of us actually have more time than we used to. Like the data suggests that on average, people are getting more time rather than less. And so it's kind of shocking that we're all feeling sort of so strapped for time. But what she finds is one of the reasons we all feel so time famished is that our time now exists in what she calls time confetti, these like little time pockets here and there. And it make it harder for us to do things that are kind of like nutritious with our time. Like we know there are nutritious things we can do with our time, like connect with a friend, or just meditate and be present, or like scribble down a few things we're grateful for, right? Things I think Action for Happiness talks about a lot. But it's harder to do those things when the time chunks are really small. And so one of my favorite tips that come from that Ashley's talked about, which I use a lot now, is she talks about making what she calls a time windfall list. So in those moments where you get some unexpected time confetti, a meeting gets canceled a little early, or you have a few minutes to kind of do something, like what are things you can do that are really nutritious uses of your time? Like not work stuff, not email, but what can you really do to kind of use that time wisely, even if it's short periods of time? And this for me has been really huge, because I think, you read these productivity books that are like, use those little time confetti things to get work done or get like 5 more emails done. But we don't often think that that's the time where I can be present and, think about what I'm grateful for, or send a really thoughtful text to a friend, or, like do something that's really going to boost your well-being. So for me, maximizing time affluence and really prioritizing time has been very, very hard. And I bet a lot of folks who are in the midst of COVID-19 can relate. Some of us are getting more time windfalls now because we're not commuting as far, or maybe not going to work in the same way. But a lot of us are even more strapped for time now that, business is babysitting and childcare and school and all these things at once. So for me, time has been huge. I think I'll just mention a second one, which is just this idea that, we often think that kind of being present with our yucky emotions is going to feel awful. And I know that's something that I was really scared about at first, right? Like I'm the kind of person who like pushes away the bad things and doesn't like conflict, especially my own internal personal conflict. But a lot of the work that I've been reading lately suggests that the ability to be present when things are feeling bad can actually be really powerful. Which again is not something that's part of our intuitions, definitely wasn't part of my intuitions, but the data really suggests it can be really powerful. And that's been one for me that both in the context of COVID-19 and in the context of the discomfort that comes when we're like facing structural inequalities so head on in the way we're doing in the current time, like it comes with a lot of yucky feelings, from sadness to anger to kind of, collective trauma, all this stuff. And the urge to run away is strong. But what I've found can be really much more powerful is finding ways to be present with these emotions, like literally giving yourself space to and time to just sit with them and be with them and see how they feel. And so I've been employing techniques by meditation teachers like Tara Brach, who uses a technique she calls RAIN, which is an acronym for recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture. And you can do that with the uncertainty and the yuckiness of COVID-19. You can do that with the pain of, I'm in the United States right now, facing the fact that your country has this awful history of racism. You can do that with a lot of the yucky stuff that you're experiencing. And the surprise is that, first of all, it actually works to sit with these emotions and nurture them, but also that it's not as bad as you often think. These emotions kind of have a course that you don't really expect if you kind of work with them. So
yes, and it's pushing them away that can often lead to them sort of festering or becoming worse. I love that Tara Brach example of the RAIN acronym. I wondered if we could maybe take one of your examples, that idea of, that perhaps the pressure that we're feeling in this crisis situation with a lot that's outside of our control. Maybe you could just walk us through what the RAIN, remind us what those things stand for, and perhaps how you would respond to feeling worried about your health or your financial security in this current situation.
Yeah. I mean, a specific example for me is that, so I live in Connecticut in the US, but my mom is in Massachusetts. She's in a different state. And she has COPD, which is a kind of lung disorder that makes her incredibly vulnerable to coronavirus. And, I hope she's doing things to be healthy. I'm not sure she's watching now, but if she is, I'm sure she's being healthy and socially distancing. But that's really scary. And it's awful to think that, I can't go see her right now. What if something happens? It might be the last time I ever saw her, right? Like these emotions and the uncertainty and the fear kind of get going. And so rather than run away from them, what RAIN would suggest is you just explicitly take time to sit with them. So do the normal meditation-y stuff, you sit, you find your breath, and then you think about, what it feels like to be scared for my mom. And I just kind of sit with that and recognize, what does that feel like? Oh, my chest is getting tight. That's fear. I almost feel like emotions almost like welling up in my face is the sensation, like, oh, that's sadness, right? And so that's the kind of recognize part about like, ooh, fear, sadness, right? And then kind of investigate this practice of like, okay, what is that? What does that really feel like? You're almost like a journalist kind of digging into these feelings. And as they come up, it's kind of a reciprocal process. That's the A for accept, which is like, doesn't feel great, but I can sit with this, kind of like the Beatles, right? Like just let it be, right? Like we're just gonna let it be, have that song playing in your head. And then, the end part, kind of once you've had a chance to sort of sit with it, is the nurture, which is to be like, it sucks to feel this stuff. What would I do if I was, say, comforting one of my Yale students about this? Or if I was talking to my child about this, like, how would I nurture it? What would I say? Right? Which is to like validate, it sucks, like, this is okay, but like, you're strong, you're going to kind of get through this. And so that process, again, a lot of these processes sound really cheesy. And when you say them, you're like, are you going to nurture your emotions? Or like, no one has good branding for some of this stuff. It all sounds a little like woo-woo. But, the data really suggests that the act of sitting with your emotions like that can allow you to process them. As you said, running away from them just like doesn't work. In fact, there's a lot of evidence in the field of psychology for what's called ironic processes, which is like, the more you kind of want to avoid fear, the more it kind of comes up. It pops into your head when you least expect it. Ironically, the act of kind of trying to stuff something down makes it kind of pop up. And so rain is
one of the nice examples we see in modern culture of what you've just been saying is this phrase that I think is so important. It's okay not to be okay has become really popular. And I think rightly so, because maybe only 5 years ago when we were doing lots of this work, there was much more stigma about mental health and talking about our emotions and feelings. And it feels like that's shifted. It's still not where it needs to be, but people are more able to express the fact that they're really struggling, even aside from some of the major challenges we've had in the last few months. But obviously it's become particularly exacerbated in recent times. One thing sort of related to that though is the ability to reach out when you're struggling to others. And I was interested to see whether you would bring up relationships as one of the sort of bedrocks of the science, because it gets talked about so much. Where do you think that fits into our understanding of what really matters for happiness, our connections to others?
Yeah, well, empirically, I mentioned that, if you want, the best tip for you might be, all kinds of different things depending on what you're prioritizing. But if you wanted to ask the question of like the best tip in general, according to the data, it is about making social connections and prioritizing relationships. We know that happy people have incredibly strong social relationships, and they put the time in, right? Like they're using their time and their free time to kind of promote those kinds of things. And this is something to remember, right? Like good relationships don't just happen naturally. You like actually have to put time in to nurture them, just like you'd nurture your career, just like you'd nurture like a garden. Like relationships kind of do take work. And so we need the time to kind of put in there. But yeah, I think relationships are incredibly important. And the flip side is even more critical, right? Like the act of not feeling like you're connected to folks, like experiencing loneliness, experiencing disconnection, can be an incredible hit on your happiness. And an incredible hit on your physical health, right? There's evidence from the former Surgeon General suggesting that loneliness is almost as bad for our physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so it becomes a happiness practice that's not just helping our mental health, but is really entwined with our physical health, with our immune function. All these things that we're thinking about right now during COVID-19, we're all doing these things to protect our physical health, like washing our hands and socially distancing. We forget that paying attention to social connection and other aspects of our mental health is a way to prioritize physical health, right? It's a way to protect our immune function.
So do you have any tips on boosting relationships? Obviously, there's the obvious things like staying connected, taking time to listen. Are there any sort of other things you can add to our armory of ways to really boost our connections with others?
Yeah, one oddly gets back to what we were talking about before, which is time affluence. Ashley finds in her data that one of the reasons having more time or feeling like you have more time boosts our happiness is when we're feeling kind of time affluent, we kind of feel the need to be social, right? And I'm sure so many people can experience this when you're feeling just kind of frantic and overwhelmed. Somebody's like, "Hey, let's get coffee." You're like, "How about never?" Like, I don't have the bandwidth for this, right? But it means we end up not doing the things that are going to protect our mental health the most, right? And so one is just kind of make sure you're giving yourself some time and free up some time so that you can be social. Another one is to try to become more other-oriented generally, just as almost like an attitude towards the world. When things get tough and challenging, like in the current crisis, we have a lot of articles about like self-care or like treat yourself. There's this television show Parks and Rec where they talk about treat yourself. And like, if you look at the data on happiness, treating yourself doesn't work as well as we often think, right? Like, happy people are donating their time to charity. You know, they're not like taking tons of bubble baths to like promote their own health. Like, they're being outward, like they're donating time to charity. They're donating money to charity. They're protesting and jumping into causes that they really think about. Like, that's what makes for happiness. And so I think that's another way we can start to be a little bit more socially connected, is whenever we're kind of feeling overwhelmed, take a step back and be like, okay, how can I just switch gears? How can I like think about someone else? How can I call an elderly neighbor who's scared? Or how can I put my time into something that's more meaningful? It feels like a crazy shift, especially when we're feeling stressed ourselves. That can feel overwhelming. But the data really suggests that when you do that, others, it can kind of open up time, but it gives you this amazing well-being boost that can be quite powerful.
So Laurie, I think that's a lovely bridge into the current situation with the COVID crisis around the world, because one of the things that I think we all saw when this first came to light was a sort of sense of togetherness that I think has been missing in recent years, certainly in certain Western countries, and people really felt that there was a sort of common threat, and there was a huge amount of kindness and compassion and outpouring. We can move on to perhaps more recent events that have perhaps been a little bit more antagonistic in some ways, or confrontational, but certainly that time at the beginning of the crisis, and still I think playing out now, massive uncertainty, massive anxiety for many people, lots of people worried, as you've mentioned yourself, with the health of loved ones, financial prospects in danger, a real sense of bleakness about what might be coming. What have you found both personally helpful, but also what can you share with us about what we can do in difficult situations in general, not just in this current crisis, but how can the happiness science help us in times of adversity?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big ones is really trying to jump in and actually do this kind of work of being more other oriented. You know, when we're feeling frantic ourselves, it's hard to reach out, but reaching out does two things. One is it helps our own well-being, so we can do it more. It kind of boosts our resilience, but also it like helps the world, right? And I think it contributes to this culture where, you know, we're not all participating in making this more of a tire fire. We're all jumping in to try to put the tire fire out, and we see other people doing that. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to. You know, the news media gravitates towards the yuckier stuff, you know, like the toilet paper hoarding and people doing bad things. But in practice, if you look, people are doing a ton of great stuff. I tried to kind of counter the news media stuff in the beginning by looking on Twitter at this hashtag called COVID kindness, which is just like simple things that people are doing to do awesome stuff. And if you looked at that, it was like, oh my gosh, like the world is not filled with the toilet paper hoarding. It's more like tiny acts of people doing amazing things. And so I think that can be really quite powerful. A second thing for me during this time of crisis that I think is so important is just to realize what you can control. You know, both the structure of what's happening with COVID, and I think realizations of how awful systemic racism are, they can make you feel out of control, right? You can kind of feel like, personally, what am I going to do to fight that, right? Like they can steal our agency. And one of the parables I keep coming back to as I think about this is a parable that reminds us how much agency we have over the bad stuff in life. And it's a more religious one. It comes from the Buddhist tradition. It's a parable of the second arrow, which some of you who've taken my class have probably heard me talk about. But the parable goes something like this. You know, Buddha's talking to his disciples and is asking them about a situation. He says, you know, if you're walking down the street and you get hit by an arrow, is that bad? And all his disciples say, yeah, it's super bad to get hit with an arrow. Then Buddha says, well, if you're walking down the street and then you get hit with a second arrow, is that even worse? And Buddha, you know, his followers say, yeah, you know, it sucks, you know, twice as bad maybe if you get hit with a second arrow. And so Buddha goes on to explain, you know, the first arrow is just suffering in life. We can't control that. You know, that's just the poop happens in the world, right? But that's the first arrow. But the second arrow is really our reactions to those things. You know, that's if we, you know, spend all of COVID-19 pouting and feeling frustrated that we're inside and, you know, kind of yelling at our kids and kind of being grumpy, you know, or if we, you know, look at the kind of the injustice in the world and we kind of shrink back or just kind of get mad about it and do nothing, right? Like that second arrow is on us. That's our reaction. And even though it might be hard, we always have control over our reactions. Like that's a shocking thing, but we always have agency over that second arrow. And that for me has been incredibly powerful, both with the big things that are happening and just like the small frustrations that come up during COVID-19, right? Like we can control more than we think. And that agency shift can put us into like challenge headspace. Like now I want to get through this game and kind of win, not in a, not just get through it, but get through it with a positive attitude.
Yeah, you're reminding me of that amazing book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. For those who don't know his story, he was in Auschwitz in the concentration camp in the most horrific situation and had many, many inspiring things to say, one of which was everything can be taken from us, but one thing, that last of human freedoms to choose your own response in any given circumstances, which I think is a lovely way of summarizing what you've just shared with us there. But you also mentioned systemic racism, and of course what's really live for so many people around the world right now is a real sense of injustice. So where does happiness and injustice overlap? How can we use both the science of well-being and what really matters to think about what's going on in terms of some of the challenges we're seeing, not just in the US, but around the world, and do what you've just done, which is sort of choose our response in a sort of constructive way? What do you think on that?
Yeah, well, I think this is incredibly important, right? I mean, I think, for Black people and for people of color who are facing this systemic racism head on, especially the anti-Black violence that we're seeing in the US right now, that is a huge mental health hit. Like, obviously, not feeling like you can walk out of your house and be safe, that causes enormous trauma. And it's the legacy of that kicks in with the trauma, right? That's not just like a kind of thing that happened with George Floyd, that's been going on for hundreds of years, right? So facing that and the continuation of facing that can just be an awful mental health hit for marginalized folks. But beyond that, I think it's a hit for everyone, right? We all don't like feeling like we live in an unjust society. And there's evidence, if you look at countrywide levels of happiness, that even though we think things like wealth predict happiness, they do to a certain extent. But another thing that predicts happiness is levels of inequality. In other words, the more unequal a particular country is in its wealth levels and its opportunities, the less happy it tends to be. So even if you're the beneficiary of these awful systems, even if you have privilege in the context of these systems, you're still going to take a well-being hit. And so I think what this shows us is that, there's a lot of talk of all lives can't matter until Black lives matter. I think all of our mental health can't matter until Black mental health matters. And I think that means that many of us need to kind of jump in and do the work. And that's true, obviously, for Black folks who are going out to try to fight these kinds of injustices. But I think it's just important for non-Black folks to do this, right? White allies really have a role to play in these kinds of conversations. And, it's a wonderful way to jump in and not just help your own well-being, right? Because you're doing work for your cause you care about, you're helping other people, but also you're helping fix historic structures that need a lot of work that have been systematically reducing mental health in our country and beyond for forever. So I think, it's almost a mental health imperative that we wind up getting involved and fighting for justice in whatever way we can.
Thank you, well said. So let's turn to a sort of forward-looking theme, really, which is, although there's a lot of fear around at the moment, there's obviously a sense of almost opportunity and hope in some respects, which is particularly with the lockdown many of us have been experiencing. I don't know about you, but personally, what I've seen in lots of people is this has been sort of a wake-up call in some ways. That one of the courses we run with Action for Happiness that's had a huge impact is called Exploring What Matters. And it sort of challenges this question of what does really matter in life. And I feel that what's happened to some extent is an awakening in many of us about the things that do really matter, that actually it's the time with loved ones, it's a sense of purpose, it's the ability to be outdoors and to connect with nature. Those are the things that matter much more than the shopping or the minutiae of our day jobs. And so that's, I think, been quite refreshing. And people are talking about this idea of building back better, both socially and environmentally. And as we look forward, not to get back to business as usual, because in many ways, business as usual was causing quite a lot of anxiety and inequality and systemic problems, as you've mentioned. So first of all, from a sort of societal point of view, we might come to the individual in a moment, but from a sort of what we'd like to see in the world around us, as you look forward, what are some of the ways that we can build back better to perhaps put more emphasis on community, relationships, mental health? What are some of the top, if you were making policy level decisions or recommendations, what are some of the things we need to get better in our society?
Yeah, well, I think, there are obviously a lot of horrible downsides of COVID-19 in this situation, but I think the fact that it's allowed us this moment to pause and really reflect on society and kind of get out of our routine so we can kind of see them a little bit more clearly. I think those kinds of pauses are incredibly rare in our own personal lives, but as a society, definitely. And I think what it's done already is to cause us to say, wait, hang on, some of these injustices are things that we don't want to be seeing in life. I mean, I think it's no surprise that Black Lives Matter and a lot of these hard conversations about racism are able to happen with this pause. I think people have seen this more clearly, and I think it's also a time when, again, we have some time windfalls in there where we can actually do something about it. So I'm really hopeful that these kinds of changes will happen. I think what we need to pay attention to and be mindful about are what are the kinds of things we've really missed about society, right? And can we bring those back, right? And, when we kind of get out of this crisis, it hasn't been like, oh, I want to be able to buy stuff and go to work and get my haircuts. For the most part, I think if you're mindful, what you miss is the social connection, is the opportunities to be out there and to congregate with the people you care about. Like, paying attention to the stuff we miss is really, really powerful to kind of get some insights about what we need to build back in. But I think on a personal level, I think this is also just as important. I think this crisis has caused a lot of us to realize that there's tons of things that we should have been incredibly grateful for in our daily lives that we kind of just were taking for granted. When I think, like, there was a time, weeks ago when I could just like walk into the grocery store and get groceries without a mask, without being afraid. It's like shocking to me, right? There was a time when I could have just driven to my mom's house at any time and gotten a hug, right? That, like, we forget that we had those opportunities that we're realizing should have brought us so much joy, and they didn't. The hope is that when we go back, hopefully we won't take them for granted as much. And that'll allow us to do two things. One is to derive joy from stuff we should have been deriving joy from before, but it'll also cause us to prioritize the right stuff. How many times did I not go see my mom because, I had some work thing, or we're just too busy, or just, whatever, like, stuff comes up. Like, I think it'll cause us to put into effect like the real priorities and to give time and energy to the stuff that actually matters. And all those things, both as societies, as we all do that more, and as individuals, I think it's going to help us live more joyful lives when we get out of this crisis.
And do you think that way we behave has this ripple effect towards others and makes a difference? Because I think one of the critiques of people who are passionate about promoting happiness and well-being is that somehow that might be turning a blind eye to some of the injustices in the world, or pretending things are fine when they're not, or being a bit inward focused. You've already made very eloquently the point that happiness is more about outward focus than perhaps sort of me. But we like this idea of this sort of Gandhi-esque approach to be the change you want to see in the world. That's at the heart of the Action for Happiness mission and ethos. Do you think the science backs that up, that actually the way we behave, the way we treat others does have that sort of wider ripple effect in our communities and society?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, and maybe even stronger than that. I think, in teaching this class, I sometimes get, critiqued by folks who think that a focus on your personal happiness is in some sense like instead of, or at an opportunity cost to, a focus on fixing the messed up structures in the world. And I actually think that view couldn't be more wrong. What we know from the science of happiness is that boosting your positive mood protects you. Like, it protects your physical health, it protects your immune function, it brings you more resilience. Focusing on positive emotions, things like compassion and gratitude, can actually allow you to boost your self-regulation, right? Like, all the tools you need to gain the willpower to do the hard stuff. Like, and it makes you more resilient, right? Like, it makes you kind of robust to kind of nasty stuff in life, and it can protect against things like burnout. All those things I've just mentioned, willpower, like protection against burnout, reasonable physical health, that's what we need to jump in and fix all the nasty structures in the world, right? And I think this idea of kind of putting our own oxygen mask on first before diving in some ways, in the face of these awful structures, is a radical act, but a really important act, because if we don't kind of focus on the individual level, I worry there's not going to be enough bandwidth to deal with the structural level. And so I actually think these things can kind of work in concert more often than people realize, that the act of kind of taking time to do these things, especially simple practices like compassion and gratitude, like, they're the key to jumping in and fixing the systemic stuff. So the hope is that what starts with us, we can't be the change we want to see in the world unless we change ourselves first.
Yes, there's that phrase, you can't pour from an empty cup, which is like your oxygen mask principle. Thank you. So in a moment, I'd like to come to some of the amazing questions people have been posting in the Q&A. Just one final thing though, really, which is obviously lots of us want to put this into practice. We want to boost our relationships. We want to be kinder to others. We want to take time to practice mindful response to difficult emotions, to stand up for what we believe in, all of this great stuff. But the theory of it, understanding the science, doesn't really change anything. It's when we put it into action. That's why we're Action for Happiness. Do you have any tips on how to sort of change habits? Because we know that habit formation is very complicated, and we're creatures of habit, and sometimes it's hard to change our patterns of behavior. Do you have any tips to help us do that?
Well, first, just to validate, I mean, I think this is the biggest puzzle of positive psychology. And when I teach my class, I start on the very first lecture with a cognitive bias that's so relevant for action for happiness, which is this cognitive bias called the Gi Joe Fallacy. For those in the US, there was this American cartoon called Gi Joe that had this very famous public service announcement ending where Gi Joe would teach kids things, and kids would say, "Thank you, Gi Joe, now I know." And then Gi Joe would say, "And knowing is half the battle." And go, "Gi Joe," if you're American, you remember this stuff. But this is what we think. We think knowing is half the battle, but like, it's not half the battle. Like, the action part is the battle. It's probably like, a tenth, maybe a fifth of the battle. Like, what you got to do is to put it into practice. And so I love that we're ending on this kind of question as we're talking here, because I think that's the key. How do you put this stuff into effect? And I think, I have lots of answers for that, but I'll give my kind of COVID-19 answer, which is, so many people signed up for my class in the midst of this crisis, which is great. I think it shows people are trying to, support their mental health. But I also get lots of emails from folks halfway through who said, I just can't do it right now. There's too much going on. Like, what I'm doing is I'm taking this class to put even more pressure on myself to be perfect. And I think sometimes the perfect gets in the way of the progress. So my COVID-19 for putting this stuff into action is, what's the baby step? Like, what's the babyest baby step you can do right now and that you really have the bandwidth for, so that it won't feel like an obligation, so it won't feel like too much. It's just something you could really do. What's a 2-minute time affluence thing you could do to change something? Or what's a way that you could kind of just take 3 minutes to regulate your breath? Like, if you're doing it right, it should feel like, that's not really going to make a difference. It should feel like nothing. But that kind of baby step means you're actually going to do it. It means you're going to take action. And that's the first step to starting the habit. So I might have lots of different answers generally, but during COVID-19, I think we need some self-compassion. I think we need to not beat ourselves up. And so I think a powerful step is, what's the babyest baby step you can start with, and just do that.
That's very good. Thank you. I'll try and put that into practice. So let's move to some of the questions. So Jen Allen has posted one in the chat that says, in all the research you've done, what's the thing that surprised you most? Perhaps the more unexpected science of happiness finding.
Yeah, there's so many things that surprise me most. I guess maybe a meta thing that surprised me most is just how absolutely bad my intuitions about this stuff are, and how absolutely bad all our intuitions about this stuff are. Money doesn't matter for happiness. Whole systems of the way our societies work is based on this misconception. Material goods don't matter for happiness. Craziness, right? My accomplishments, while they might kind of give me, some sense of purpose, if I fill things too much, that's not going to matter for my happiness. What matters for doing good in the world, having some free time, right? So much of the way we structure things and go about problem solving is based on these awful intuitions. And I'm continually shocked at how bad those intuitions are, how we just really get it wrong. And so I think for me, that's been the biggest surprise is I think minds should just be designed in a reasonable way to promote happiness and human flourishing. But the fact of the matter is they're just not. And so taking action for happiness, the first step is often realizing that our intuitions just suck, and that the path to happiness is going to feel like we're doing the wrong thing, and for me, especially in times of crisis, this can be really important. I'm constantly, if I'm feeling stressed or whatever, I'm like, what's the most nutritious thing I can do for happiness right now? And often it's not what I think. It's not what I want to do. It's I should pick up the phone and call my mom. I don't feel like it. I'd rather just watch Netflix, or, have a pint of ice cream that's in the freezer. But no, I'm going to try it. And then you do it and you're like, oh, that felt good. And it's why can't my intuitions update? They just won't, right? So for me, it's how bad our intuitions are and how bad mine continue to be, despite the fact that I've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, I found that if I build into my sort of to-do list, not just the work commitments, but also the things I know I need to do, the daily gratitude, the mindfulness in the morning, and it becomes a thing I do on my to-do list. It becomes a way of nudging my intuitions to remember to do those things. The next questions, there's two, in fact, they're both related to schools and students. So Paul has said, "Dear Laurie, I work in a school and a number of students are suffering from mental health and wellbeing issues, especially during remote learning. Can you offer some advice to help them with their happiness?" And then sort of related, Joy has said, "I'd love to know how, Laurie, how you're combating school pressures around student achievements and focus on academics, because obviously the social and emotional development is is really important. So there's a couple of related things there about mental health and well-being and the priorities in schools. What would you suggest?
Yeah. Well, first a plug for what we're trying to do. You know, we rolled this class out obviously to Yale students at the college age level, and we've been kind of putting content online both in the podcast and as part of the Coursera class for adult learners. But we're actually kind of in the process of developing resources for younger learners right now, both for middle school in the US, middle school and high school age. So basically learners from like 13 to 18, in part because I think we need these tips early on. And just as I think it was Joy's question suggested, you know, kids are on the wrong path, right? They're focused on achievement and grades and all this stuff at the expense of social connection, doing nice things for others, mere presence, time affluence, right? It's almost like the things we're causing our kids to prioritize are exactly the opposite of what we know is useful for well-being. And so if you're listening to this and you're interested in that, you know, drop me a line on Twitter or via email, and I can put you in touch with those resources, especially if you're a teacher or someone who works in schools. We're hoping to make connections. But all that said, I mean, I think part of it is that, again, you know, the kids' intuitions are going to be off about this stuff, right, in terms of what matters. But problematically, all their parents and all the adults and all the teachers' intuitions are going to be off about what matters. And so I think one of the best things you can do for your own kids is to understand these intuitions and to fight back against those societal pressures. One of the best things, one of the best sets of emails, I get lots of emails from people who've taken the class and tell me, you know, how it's affected them and things, but I get lots of emails from parents who happen to watch the Coursera lectures with their kids. And it's really enlightening because parents will often say, you know, as they're watching the lectures, they'll say, you know, see, that's the thing I tell you, you know, gratitude and time affluence. And their kids will be like, Mom, like, that's not what you say at all. You know, you do X, Y, and Z, which is totally the opposite of that. And parents will have this realization of like, whoa, like I thought, you know, I was presenting this thing, but my kids heard it in a completely different way. And so I think one thing that parents can do is to really try to reinforce these principles that science is projecting. It's going to be the opposite of what kids are getting from their schools in a lot of ways, and sometimes even from society. But you can do a lot to prioritize the stuff that really matters. And watch out, because often what you prioritize, there can be an opportunity cost to it. So you can think, well, you know, I prioritize grades and achievement and sports success, but I also prioritize, you know, social connection and doing for others. Sometimes they don't all get in the same way. Sometimes you have to kind of tip the balance more towards the stuff that, you know, empirical science shows is really good for well-being, which might not be grades. It might not be achievement in the same way, but that might do wonders for getting your kids and hopefully a whole new generation on the right path.
Talking of which, I can hear my children giggling in the background outside the door. There's been a couple of comments about introverts and extroverts. I think particularly in a situation where we're talking about the importance of relationships, and indeed when people are feeling a bit isolated. If you're more introverted, how can you do some of this cultivating of connection? And is that so important? And are there subtle differences between different personality types?
Yeah, I can relate because, you know, my instinct is not to make social connection. You know, I often preach about these studies that show that kind of chatting with a stranger, say on a train or, you know, a plane or something, improves your happiness. And I'm like the anti-talker on, you know, public transport and on planes and things like that. But what I've found is like, if you dig into the data, you know, folks like Nick Epley and Liz Dunn and colleagues, like they've looked at these personality variables. And what they find inevitably is that whether you self-report being an introvert or an extrovert, that doesn't actually map on to the pleasure you get from social connection. In other words, people from all personality types benefit from these close relationships. What differs, particularly in Nick Epley's data, is the prediction we make about what we're going to get from it. What does that mean? That means if you're an extrovert, you know what the science is showing. You know that social connection is going to feel good. But if you're an introvert, you have exactly the wrong predictions I was talking about just a second ago. You're thinking like, oh, this is going to be annoying and I'm not going to be able to do it. But the data shows if you just engage, you pretty much get the same benefit that the extroverts get. And so I think one tip for introverts is just like, try it, go for it, force yourself in the same way that sometimes you gotta like, you know, force yourself to like get on the treadmill in the morning. And the data really suggests that if you do that, you know, you will reap the benefits. But again, you know, with the kind of caveat that I said, like baby steps, you know, you don't want to like dive into the marathon of social connection if you're kind of been like the social connection couch potato. But with those baby steps, try it out and recognize that our intuitions might not be perfectly calibrated to the benefit we're going to get from it.
And there are different ways, of course. So we've had a lot of focus on face-to-face in communities, and some people we've been moving our community gatherings online recently, and we've had people joining who said, I never felt confident going to the one in the community centre or the pub, but actually now it's on Zoom, I feel a little bit less exposed and I'm wanting to reach out. So that's been nice. Here's an interesting question from Norma. She says, what can you do when you're sort of working on your own well-being, feeling better, following these kind of tips, but the people around you have a negative attitude, and perhaps they're people you can't disconnect with, like friends and family? How, we can't control others, we can only control ourselves, but what can we do in those situations? Because it's really hard, especially if you're locked down together.
Yeah. No, I think this is like the hardest one, right? Is that, there are these people who can kind of bring us down, right? Emotional contagion is a thing, right? We did a wonderful podcast episode where I talked with Sigal Barsaid at Wharton Business School. And she talks about, emotional contagion and affective spirals. When you're with somebody negative, you kind of catch the negative emotions, and then you're negative and you transmit that to your kids and your spouse and whatever. But what she points out in her affective spiral research is that that goes both ways, right? If you're around a negative person and you can catch their negativity, that also means that the causal arrow can go in the other direction too. If you're doing your gratitude journaling and you're engaging in social connection, you're doing the stuff you need for you, you're going to project that positivity out. And even if it doesn't feel like they're catching it, they might not become, like the perfect, visions of happy emojis that you expect, but they're going to catch it a little bit. And so one way that you can really affect the people around you isn't to kind of force them like, no, be happier. It's just to be happy yourself. Barsaid talks about kind of being the affective spiral we want to see in the world. Like the change can start with you. And I think that's true in these local relationships, when you're in lockdown with a kind of negative person. But it also means that can be true online, right? Oftentimes we say, Facebook is such a mess, or Twitter is so negative. You can be the one that sparks that first change. You can be the one that does the positive post. And that means that you're going to affect somebody else's positivity and so on. So remember that just as others are causal agents in our own emotional well-being, so too can we use our own emotions to help others.
Well, thank you. Well said. And a sort of related question, one of a couple from Hannah, Eddie, Alex and Janie from Bedford, who I guess maybe a group who are locked down together right now. Do we have any tips for being better at listening and also for being there for friends and family when they're not okay? So it's more, how can we be that empathic listener if it's someone who really needs our support? What ways can we do that better?
Yeah, well, one way is really to reach out. I think we sometimes get scared of we don't want to say the wrong thing, right? We feel like it might be awkward to check in, but the research suggests that doing that feels more powerful than we think. One of I think the big messages that coming out of the research on social connection is that we have these kind of incorrect theories about it. We don't think it's going to be that good for us. One is that we assume other people know we're really grateful for them. They never assume it. So sharing gratitude can be really powerful. But another is we kind of think if somebody really wanted us to reach out, they'd sort of ask. Or we kind of get awkward of I could bring up the fact that I'm really worried about this person, but it might be, a little uncomfortable. In all these cases, it's just better to take action, right? Ask people what's up, check in with them, how are you? I'm fine. Really? Check in with them, right? And kind of have that moment of openness where they can really reply back. It's amazing how much just that moment of being vulnerable can allow other people to share with us in ways we don't expect. And I think that's particularly true for folks who are thinking about being allies in the current crisis that we're experiencing with anti-Black violence, right? People of color and Black people in particular are going through something really awful right now that, the folks who are listening to this who aren't people of color, who aren't from marginalized communities, you might not see. It's worth the checking in, right? Again, we don't want to do it because it's going to feel awkward and whatever, but taking that moment to feel vulnerable ourselves can often be a gift to someone else who really needs someone to talk to.
Thank you. I know we're rapidly running out of your precious time, Laurie. I'm very grateful for all of these wonderful insights. I'm just choosing between some of these fabulous.
There's so many. I'm just watching the little ticker go up.
So many great things. One that struck me that was, I think, really interesting and brings us perhaps full circle back to this idea of our well-being being integrated with others, but it's about, are we born kind? I mean, there's this sort of competing views on human nature. One is that we're self-interested and selfish and sort of only interested in promoting our own well-being. Another is that we are born compassionate and kind. I personally feel that sort of these are both aspects of human nature, and in some ways the role of society is to try and bring out the good side of human nature. But what's your view on that, and how much of this is innate and how much of it has to be cultivated?
Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit of both. I mean, the surprising set of research findings is that, if you look at little kids are surprisingly kind. We think nature is kind of selfish and brutish and things, but if you look, young children are ready to, give up their resources to help others. Young children get the boost of happiness that comes from helping others. Even like toddlers, who we think of as like the prototypical, like selfish agents in the world. Like there's work by Liz Dunn and Kylie Hamlin showing that, they're happier giving up something to someone else than they are getting it themselves. Right. And so I think that shows, at the very least, there are motivations and inklings that we have even before society has had any effect to make us like social individuals, kind individuals, and ones who really want to promote all these great virtues. And I think it's really up to societies and cultures to kind of shape those things in the right direction. I think these things respond a lot to the kind of information we're getting, and I think this is definitely true, even beyond children in the COVID crisis. When we watch the news and we're like, oh God, everybody's hoarding toilet paper and being jerks, it makes us kind of want to do a little bit more of that behavior. But the more we look and peek and see, wait a minute, like, everybody's trying to do the right thing. There's so many gestures of kindness out there. We can kind of get our own moral juices flowing. We are herd animals to a certain extent. And I think it's really important to show that, not only are there norms of virtue and norms of kindness, but really lots of folks are doing this stuff if you look.
And I think that's probably all we've got time for in terms of questions, but to sort of summarize and draw this all together, what's so inspiring about your work and the messages you're sharing with so many millions of people around the world is that our actions matter. They matter to ourselves, and we can make perhaps much more of a difference to the well-being of ourselves and those around us than we might imagine. But it's also that that we can have this effect on others in a very constructive way, even in the face of these difficult emotions, these horrific situations we might find ourselves in. And I think that's a really empowering message. So rather than happiness being about sort of navel gazing or self-obsession or hedonism, it's about actually cultivating the best in us and trying to contribute the best we can to the world around us. So we're all so grateful to you for being here to share just a little snapshot of all the amazing work you've been doing. Is there any sort of final thought you'd like to leave the audience with in terms of, putting this into practice and why this matters?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the final thought will be that, as we've just discussed, happiness takes work and it takes action. But now you know what you need to do, right? And there's this wonderful opportunity that you have to really reshape your life and to reshape society. So go for it.
Thank you, Laurie. And could you just remind us where we can find your wonderful Science of Wellbeing course for anyone who wants to take part in it?
Yeah, it's called The Science of Wellbeing, as you said, and it's available on Coursera.org. You can also check out our work on our podcast, which is called The Happiness Lab, and you can download The Happiness Lab wherever you get your podcasts.
Yes, and I'd like to give a very strong personal endorsement of that. I'm a big podcast listener. I cycle most days. That's my big boost for well-being. So I have a lot of time listening to podcasts, and I absolutely love the Happiness Lab. And even as someone who's been following this research for many years, I always find new insights and exciting ways of looking at the world through your work. So if you haven't checked out the Happiness Lab, do that. It's both been very helpful during the COVID crisis, but also with just general tips for our own happiness, but making the world a happier place. And I think let's leave it with that thought that we can all affect our own happiness and we can all help make the world a happier place. And we're very grateful to you, Laurie, for sparing this time this evening and for all of your amazing work. Thank you for being here. And thank you to all the thousands of participants who've been part of this today. We will share a video of this so you can pass it on to others. We're very grateful for all the hundreds and hundreds of comments, and sorry that we didn't get to more of the amazing questions, but thank you for those who sent them in. Have a great evening or rest of your day, everyone. And Laurie, thank you so much once again.
Thanks so much. See you all soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.